Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive, where we take that overwhelming mountain of sources, all the research, the notes, the deep psychological studies, and we try to distill it down into the core knowledge you can actually use.
And our mission today is a bit like getting the blueprints to the human mind.
I like that. We are plunging into the systematic study of compliance and persuasion. You think of the most successful people in sales, advertising, recruitment.
Right. They aren't just charismatic. It's not magic. They know exactly which psychological buttons we all have. We're looking at the core mechanics of how they achieve that dazzling success, often, it seems, without any effort at all.
It's such an unnerving topic because it really hits close to home. The core idea here is that we are all, every single one of us, operating with these powerful automatic psychological shortcuts.
Tapes. Our brains rely on them to save mental energy in a world that is just. It's far too complex for constant critical analysis of every little thing.
And that efficiency, that very necessity, is precisely what makes us exploitable.
Exactly. So we're looking for the precise weapons of automatic influence that exist out there in our social environment,
Okay.
just waiting to be triggered.
The foundational idea is introduced as the click-whirr mechanism, right? It sounds almost robotic.
It is robotic, and it comes from ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. Scientists observe these things they call fixed action patterns.
Okay.
These are intricate, rigid sequences of behavior that once you trigger them, they run to completion in the exact same way every single time, like a pre-programmed tape.
And what's wild is that the trigger itself is often, it's laughably simple.
Oh, completely. Let's look at the classic example. The mother turkey. A mother turkey is incredibly devoted, very protective of her young.
Right.
But that devotion isn't triggered by, the baby turkey's smell or its feel or its appearance.
So what is it then?
It's triggered by a single specific feature. The cheep cheep sound of a baby turkey.
No way.
Yes. So the famous experiment involves showing the mother turkey a stuffed polecat, a natural mortal enemy. Instinctively, she goes into a rage, attacking it, squawking furiously.
Okay, that makes sense. Predator response.
But if the experimenters hide a tiny little recorder inside that same stuffed polecat and it plays the simple, singular cheep cheep sound,
Oh, I think I see where this is going.
everything changes. Not only does she stop the attack, she physically gathers the polecat underneath her. She treats it maternally.
She mothers her mortal enemy.
She mothers her mortal enemy, and the aggression only starts again the second the recording is turned off. She will embrace an enemy just because it plays the right sound. The cheep cheep is that single trigger feature. It's a true click-whirr response.
That is genuinely astonishing. You're talking about a sophisticated animal being reduced to an automaton by one simple stimulus.
And it's not isolated to turkeys. Not at all.
Right. The source also mentions the male robin.
Yes, the male robin. Its territorial defense is triggered by a specific patch of red breast feathers. If experimenters just present a clump of red feathers tied together,
Nothing else, just the feathers.
nothing else, it will vigorously attack it. But if they present a perfect, featherless replica of a rival robin, a biologically correct model, all the right shapes but no red feathers, it completely ignores it.
Wow, so it's just that one trigger.
It's the single correct trigger feature that matters. And this leads to the crucial takeaway, right? These shortcuts, they usually work well for survival. Generally speaking, only healthy baby chicks go cheep cheep. It's an efficient system.
But the efficiency creates the opening for manipulation.
That's the vulnerability. If the environment changes or if some profiteer comes along and fakes the trigger feature, that highly efficient system becomes a liability. And we, as humans, operate with these exact same internal tapes.
And the exploiters know how to trigger them.
They call it the jujitsu of influence. The manipulators rarely use personal force or logical arguments. They just step aside and trigger the immense power that's already inherent in the psychological principle itself.
So they exert very little personal effort, but they get this dazzling compliance.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack the first of these major psychological weapons, the one that targets our perception, the contrast principle.
The contrast principle is fundamental to how we experience reality. Specifically, how we perceive the difference between two things that are presented sequentially.
So one after the other.
Right. If the second item is fairly different from the first, we don't just see the difference. Our brain perceives it as more different than it actually is. It exaggerates the gap.
I think the best way to grasp this is to go back to the psychophysics lab, that classic demonstration with the buckets of water.
That's the one. You set up 3 buckets. You put one hand in very cold water, the other in very hot water. Your senses adjust to those extremes. Then you plunge both hands at the same time into a third bucket, which is just filled with lukewarm, room temperature water.
And the result is immediate bewilderment, because the perception is completely relative. The hand that was in the cold water feels like it's now in hot water,
While the hand that was in the hot water feels like it's in cold water.
even though both hands are in the same bucket.
Exactly. The core lesson is clear. The same thing can seem dramatically different depending entirely on the context of the event that preceded it. And you can bet compliance professionals have weaponized this.
Retail clothiers are masters of this, and they use the principle in a way that's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think, logically, you should sell the cheaper item first, right? Get the customer into spending mood, get a small win.
But they do the exact opposite, specifically to maximize this contrast principle. Salespeople are instructed to sell the most expensive item first, let's say a $495 suit.
Okay, so you establish that high price point first.
You establish the anchor. Once that number has been mentally accepted by the customer, subsequent accessories, a $95 sweater, a $70 shirt, they just don't seem excessive by comparison.
That $95 sweater, which on its own would feel expensive, suddenly seems like a drop in the bucket next to the nearly $500 suit. It's a psychological relief.
And the source material supports this empirically. People will almost always pay significantly more for accessories if they buy them after the suit than if they buy them beforehand.
Because if you show the cheap sweater first, then the expensive suit, the suit looks even more costly.
It creates resistance. Exactly.
And this isn't just limited to retail. The real estate world uses this aggressively, sometimes with properties they don't even intend to sell.
This is where you get the setup or rundown properties. The source described going undercover with a realtor named Phil. And Phil would keep a few genuinely ugly, rundown houses on his listings, priced just a little bit above what they were worth.
So they wouldn't sell.
They were just anchors, purely for psychological effect. Phil would start the showing with these dumps. The buyer would walk through, getting frustrated, feeling the sticker shock for a crumbling house.
And
Then Phil would pivot and show the property he actually wanted to sell, a genuine, moderately priced property in his inventory. And the buyer's immediate reaction, as Phil said, was that their eyes would light up.
because that house looked amazing by contrast.
It looked like a palace. They felt relief, a sense of discovery. They thought the second house was inherently a great deal, completely missing the fact that their perception was manufactured by that initial comparison.
And that's the jujitsu of it, right? It's virtually undetectable.
Yeah.
The manipulator isn't forcing you. They're just triggering a natural perceptual principle and directing it in their favor.
Exactly. The victim sees their own compliance, wow, that house is great, as being determined by, natural factors, not the intentional design of the person who profits.
That's a great segue. The contrast principle warps our perception of objects, but our next weapon targets something much deeper, our societal obligations. Let's move on to the rule for reciprocation.
This rule is, it might be the most powerful societal lever of all. It's that deep-seated, often unconscious obligation we all feel to repay favors, gifts, invitations, concessions.
When you look at anthropology and sociology, this rule is everywhere. It's cited as being absolutely pervasive, found in pretty much every human society ever studied.
Right. It suggests that if I give you something, I am owed something in return, eventually.
Richard Leakey, the famous archaeologist, went so far as to say that this is the very essence of what makes us human. He argued we became human when our ancestors learned to share their food and their skills in an honored network of obligation.
And that makes perfect sense. The adaptive advantage is profound. It allowed early humans to confidently share limited resources, food from a hunt, specialized labor, knowing that the gift wasn't just lost.
It lowered the risk of cooperating.
Exactly. It lowered the natural inhibitions against starting these complex systems of aid and trade. It binds individuals into highly efficient, cooperative units. If I can rely on you to return the favor later, we both survive better now.
But because it's so deeply implanted, so necessary for society to function, it is remarkably easy to exploit.
The famous Regan study at Cornell University gave a brilliant, contained demonstration of this vulnerability.
Okay, this is the one where subjects were rating paintings with a partner named Joe, who was secretly part of the experiment.
That's the one. They wanted to test the power of an unsolicited favor. So in the key condition, Joe leaves the room for a minute and comes back with 2 Cokes, giving one unsolicited to the subject, saying, "I got this for you."
And in the control group, he just comes back empty-handed.
Right. Later, Joe approaches the subjects and asks them to buy some raffle tickets for a new car. He says he'll win a prize if he sells the most.
And the finding was jaw-dropping.
It was. Subjects who got the unsolicited Coke bought twice as many raffle tickets from Joe compared to those who got nothing. That small favor immediately generated a quantifiable level of indebtedness.
And here's the truly crucial part that shows the rule's power. This was true regardless of whether the subjects even liked Joe.
Exactly. They were asked to rate how much they liked him, and even if they found him personally unpleasant, the obligation created by the Coke forced them to comply.
The rule is so powerful it just overrides personal feelings. So people we might ordinarily dislike, an unsavory salesperson, a representative of an unpopular group, can increase compliance just by giving a small favor first.
The classic example of this strategic pivot involves the Hare Krishna Society back in the 70s.
Right. Their initial begging tactics were failing miserably. The average person found their appearance and their approach abrasive. They had a huge PR problem and were in financial trouble.
So they pivoted. They pivoted specifically to weaponize reciprocity. They went from just begging to actively giving a small, unsolicited gift. First, usually a flower or a little booklet in public places like airports.
By providing that small favor, they engaged the reciprocity rule. And even if you were annoyed and threw the flower in the trash 2 steps later, the obligation had already been created.
Yes, compliance giving a small donation became far more likely just to neutralize that psychological discomfort of having taken something without giving in return.
And this mechanism, it scales up beautifully into high-stakes environments, like politics, the practice known as log rolling.
Oh, absolutely. Think about President Lyndon Johnson. His ability to pass landmark legislation early in his presidency was remarkable. But it wasn't just raw political skill.
It was his ability to call in old favors from his decades in the House and Senate. He had this vast bank account of reciprocal obligations to draw upon.
And then you look at the counterexample, Jimmy Carter. He campaigned successfully as an outsider, someone not indebted to the Washington establishment.
Which was his appeal.
It was. But once in office, he struggled immensely to get his programs through Congress, despite having large Democratic majorities. And why? Because he was indebted to no one on Capitol Hill, and critically, no one there was indebted to him. He had no reciprocal capital.
The blunt reality of this was captured perfectly by Charles H. Keating, Jr. when he was questioned about the $1.3 million he contributed to 5 U.S. senators. They asked him point-blank if he expected something in return.
And Keating's response was refreshingly, frighteningly honest. He said, "I want to say in the most forceful way I can, I certainly hope so." Those contributions were simply high-value investments in future obligation.
Commercial examples are everywhere, too, often masked as a trial period, like the Amway Corporation's method with the Bug Kit.
Right, the beauty utensil goods kit. Amway reps would leave this kit, a big assortment of cleaners, soaps, beauty products, with prospective customers for a bit.
And the intention was that the customers would partially consume some of the products. They'd try the soap, use the cleaner.
Exactly. So when the salesperson returned, the customers were trapped. They had accepted and used an unsolicited favor. When they were asked to place an order, they faced that powerful cognitive discomfort of the reciprocity rule.
So they often yielded, even if they didn't intend to buy a thing.
Now, the rule is powerful enough for favors, but it extends even further. It covers concessions. Society benefits hugely when we compromise. So for people to initiate cooperation, they need to feel safe making the first sacrifice.
And that sense of safety is provided by the reciprocity rule. If I make a concession, I know you are obligated to return one.
And this realization leads directly to one of the most effective 2-pronged compliance tactics, reciprocal concessions or the rejection then retreat technique.
Often called the door-in-the-face technique.
Right. The strategy is simple. You first make a massive, often preposterous request that you know is almost guaranteed to be rejected. The door in the face. Then you immediately retreat to the smaller desired request.
And the genius is that the retreat itself is seen as a concession on your part.
Which means the reciprocity rule kicks in, and the victim feels obligated to return a concession, which is compliance with your smaller request.
The source recounts an experience with a Boy Scout who first asked him to buy $5 worth of raffle tickets. He politely refused.
And the scout immediately retreated, saying, well, if you don't want the tickets, how about just buying a $1 chocolate bar? The author complied instantly.
Even though he knew he didn't want the candy.
The obligation was just too strong. This is used constantly by negotiators. Think about TV producers like Grant Tinker or Gary Marshall using this to get sensitive material on the air.
Marshall admitted to deliberately inserting lines into scripts that he knew were guaranteed to be censored. Lines that were way stronger than what he actually wanted.
He'd put in something overtly sexual or violent, so when the network censors would inevitably axe that strong line, he would pivot. Retreat to the slightly weaker line he had wanted all along.
And the censors, having just made a large concession by rejecting the first line, felt the need to make a reciprocal concession. So they'd approved the slightly weaker line because it felt like a fair compromise.
And here is why this technique is so frighteningly effective. It pulls two major weapons at the same time. First, reciprocity, as the retreat is a concession that must be matched.
And second, it engages the contrast principle, which we just discussed. The smaller desired request looks even smaller and more reasonable next to that huge opening request. Asking for $5 seems like nothing if you were just asked for $100.
That combination is what leads to catastrophic judgment errors. And no error is more famous than the approval of the ridiculously risky Watergate break-in plan proposed by G. Gordon Liddy.
It is truly astonishing that John Mitchell and Jeb Magruder approved a plan described as risky, pointless, and potentially calamitous, especially when Nixon's re-election was already a sure thing.
But the key is the context. That $250,000 plan, as foolish as it was, represented a massive concession from Liddy's first two proposals.
Right. His initial pitch was a $1 million monstrosity that included a chase plane, kidnapping squads, and a yacht with call girls.
It's absurd. Cartoon supervillain stuff. They rejected that. Liddy then retreated to a $500,000 plan. They rejected that too.
And finally, he presented the $250,000 plan, framing it as the bare bones, minimum operational budget.
So Mitchell and Magruder, who had sat through two prior meetings with these insane, expensive plans, were psychologically relieved. They felt they should leave Liddy a little something.
The rejection then retreat was complete. They approved a disastrous plan because it felt like a compromise they had negotiated down, not because it made any logical sense.
And we know this because the only person who objected objectively, Frederick LaRue, wasn't at the prior two meetings. He wasn't influenced by the contrast or the pressure to concede. He just saw the plan for the folly it was.
Beyond just getting that initial yes, the technique has these incredible, long-lasting side effects. It spurs victims not only to agree, but to actively carry out the agreement and volunteer for more requests later.
The blood donation study demonstrated this perfectly. Students were first asked for this massive commitment donating blood every 6 weeks for 3 years. When they refused, the requester retreated to the real goal, a single pint donation right now.
And compared to the control group, who were only asked for the single pint, the rejection then retreat group was way more likely to agree to be called to donate again later. The numbers are striking. 84% versus 43%.
And the reason, and this is where the genius lies, is that the victim feels greater responsibility for and satisfaction with the final arrangement. They see the outcome not as a forced compliance, but as a successful negotiation. They bargain the requester down.
Which makes them more invested in following through.
And feeling good about it.
That sense of shared responsibility is a perfect bridge because it takes us directly into how we manage our own self-image. And that leads us to our third powerful driver, the nearly obsessive need for commitment and consistency.
That's absolutely right. The core idea is we have this powerful, nearly obsessive desire to be and appear to be consistent with what we've already done. Once a choice is made, all these internal and external pressures kick in to make us behave in ways that justify that choice.
You see this with something as simple as gambling. Racetrack bettors, right after placing a bet, become much more confident in their horse's chances of winning than they were just moments before.
And nothing about the external odds has changed. The only variable is their active commitment buying the ticket. That small commitment triggers the deep-seated consistency pressure to convince themselves they made the right choice.
They need their beliefs to align with their actions. Then there's the deeply painful real-world consequence in the story of Sarah and Tim. Sarah broke off her engagement, canceled a wedding, to take back her ex-boyfriend Tim, who promised to marry her, and quit drinking.
And Tim almost immediately reneged on both promises. He was still drinking, marriage was off the table. Yet 2 years later, Sarah was even more devoted to him. She convinced herself that being forced to choose him proved he was truly number one in her heart.
She created an inner reality that was consistent with her difficult commitment, even when the justification for that commitment was gone.
So why are we so dedicated to this blind consistency? What's the appeal?
It's a massive shortcut. Once a stand is taken, we don't have to do the real labor of thinking anymore. Consistency lets us evade the rigors of continuing thought.
Sir Joshua Reynolds said it best centuries ago. There is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the real labor of thinking. It's a psychological shield.
A hiding place.
It is. Mechanical consistency is a fortress against troubling realizations. If straight thinking would lead to harsh consequences or self-doubt like realizing you just invested in a bad relationship or a bad product, consistency builds the walls to protect you from that cognitive dissonance.
The Transcendental Meditation, or TM recruiting example, is perfect for this. They brought in a logician, an expert, who clearly and systematically demolished the logic of the TM program during a lecture.
The argument was rationally annihilated. Yet, immediately after, the recruiters were flooded with people rushing to submit their $75 down payments. It was a race to commit.
Why the immediate rush? The logic had just been destroyed.
Because the commitment, the down payment, was the self-defense mechanism. One man even admitted it. He said he knew he had to pay now, or he'd go home and start thinking about what he said and never sign up.
So by making the commitment, he activated the consistency tape. I already put my money down for it, didn't I? He was hiding inside that commitment to avoid confronting the logician's points.
So commitment is the key. Getting someone to take a stand, to go on record, is the essential first step. And this was used in a much darker context in the Chinese POW camps during the Korean War.
That's a chilling case study. The Chinese communists were incredibly effective at getting American soldiers to collaborate, and they did it not through brutality, but through a sophisticated psychological assault based on commitment.
Their strategy was purely start small and build.
They'd begin with what seemed like tiny, trivial requests, like asking prisoners to write down minor anti-American or pro-communist statements, maybe something as simple as, "America is not perfect."
These seemingly insignificant acts served as the initial small commitments, and they could then use those to build toward deeper collaboration and attitude change. That small act of taking a stand, even a tiny one, changes your internal self-perception.
And the method mattered. They were obsessed with getting prisoners to write things down.
Yeah.
By the focus on writing?
Writing is an act of commitment. It's a physical, undeniable action that confirms a choice and leads to genuine personal change, much more than just a passive agreement. Once it's written down, the words belong to you.
And I recall the source mentioned they used essay contests. The prizes were tiny, a few cigarettes, a bit of fruit. Why keep the reward so small?
That's a critical insight. If the reward were large, say a promise of early release, the prisoner would have a strong external justification for writing the essay. I did it for the prize. A small reward isn't enough to justify the action externally. This forces the prisoner to accept inner responsibility for the content. I wrote this because I must believe at some level that America isn't perfect.
This feeds right into the other key factor, the public eye. We feel enormous pressure to stay consistent with public commitments.
Absolutely. The Chinese constantly displayed these statements, posted them, read them on the camp radio, often signed by the soldier. We maintain public stands fiercely because we want to avoid looking fickle, uncertain, or pliant.
We see this even in mock legal settings. Studies show when experimental juries used a visible show of hands, hung juries were way more frequent than with a secret ballot. Jurors were just more reluctant to change a publicly stated mind.
And that anecdote about the woman who quit smoking is another great example. She sent signed business cards to everyone she wanted to respect her, reading, "I promise you that I will never smoke another cigarette."
The public, undeniable commitment created this external pressure field she couldn't escape.
Exactly. She said whenever she wanted to smoke, she'd picture how all those people would think less of her if she failed. The fear of public inconsistency gave her the pressure she needed.
And consistency also demands justification for effort. We maintain commitments that required great effort or pain. This is the logic behind hazing rituals.
The famous Aronson and Mills study in 1959 showed this with college women. They had them endure a severely embarrassing initiation ceremony to join a discussion group. And the women who went through the ordeal rated the group, which was intentionally dull and worthless, as extremely valuable.
The greater the effort or pain, the higher the perceived value.
It's the psychological mechanism that ensures loyalty in groups that demand a high price of admission. Whether it's fraternity hell week, the beatings, the cold, the unsavory food, or military boot camp.
So these acts aren't just sadism, they're acts of group survival, ensuring that those who make it through justify the effort by elevating the group's worth.
But maybe the most subtle part of this principle is how to get people to take inner responsibility for a choice. This is where the difference between a strong threat and a mild warning becomes critical, as shown in the toy robot experiment.
Right. Children were shown a highly attractive robot toy and forbidden from playing with it. One group got a severe threat. The researcher would be very angry and will have to do something about it. The other group got a mild warning. It is wrong to play with the robot.
And both groups obeyed temporarily. The difference came 6 weeks later when the researcher was gone.
Of the boys who got the severe threat, 77% immediately played with the robot. The strong threat had only provided a temporary external justification.
But the results for the mild warning group were completely different. Only 33% of those boys played with the robot 6 weeks later. The mild pressure was just enough to get compliance, but not strong enough to provide an external reason.
So it forced the boys to look inward and accept inner responsibility. They convinced themselves, I didn't play with it because I decided it was wrong. And that subtle shift led to a lasting change.
And this internal change is what makes commitments grow their own legs. Once the decision is made, new reasons and justifications are created internally to support it, meaning the commitment persists even if the original incentive is removed.
This is the foundation of the infamous car dealership technique.
Yeah.
Lowballing.
Yes. The dealer offers a highly favorable, non-genuine price, say $400 below competitors, to induce the initial purchase decision.
They have no intention of honoring that price.
None. The sole purpose is to get the commitment. Once the prospect decides to buy, they do all the commitment activities, fill out forms, arrange financing, maybe drive the car for a day, and in doing so, they generate new internal justifications. They love the handling, the color is perfect.
Then the original advantage is removed. The salesman finds an error, or the manager lowers the trade-in value, pulling the price back up.
And because the commitment has already grown its own new legs, customers often proceed with the purchase even when the price is no longer competitive. They've convinced themselves they want this car.
It's pure manipulation.
And it can even be used for good, as seen in the energy conservation study. Homeowners were promised newspaper publicity if they conserved gas, and they cut their usage significantly.
But then came the lowball. The publicity incentive was canceled. They were told they wouldn't be in the paper after all.
Remarkably, they increased their energy savings even further. The initial commitment had created a self-image as a conservation-minded citizen that persisted and intensified after the original external reward was pulled away.
That is a stunning example of how self-persuasion is so much more powerful than external pressure. Okay, let's pivot to our fourth major weapon, one that relies entirely on external context: social proof.
The principle of social proof is simple. We tend to see an action as more appropriate or correct when other people are doing it. As a general rule, we make fewer mistakes by acting in accord with social evidence than against it.
It's a powerful, efficient shortcut. But just like the turkey's cheap, that efficiency is its major weakness. It makes us incredibly vulnerable to fake evidence.
The most blatant example is canned laughter in TV shows. We all intellectually know it's a transparent forgery, yet studies have repeatedly found that canned laughter makes audiences laugh longer and rate material, especially poor jokes, as funnier.
The sound is divorced from real humor, but it acts as that perfect trigger feature. Our automatic tape just plays. Other people are laughing, so this must be funny.
And this fakery has a long history. In 19th century opera houses, they had claques professional applauders whose services were openly advertised, offering everything from ordinary applause to wild enthusiasm, a special sum to be arranged.
And in modern advertising, we have the consumers from Mars actors posing as regular people stopped on the street, giving these testimonials. They're obvious fakes, but they still try to trigger that automatic social proof response.
But social proof doesn't just go wrong when it's manipulated. It can go wrong naturally, often with tragic results, especially in situations of uncertainty. This leads to the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, or the bystander effect.
The foundational, heartbreaking example here is the Catherine Genovese case in 1964. 38 neighbors watched a woman be assaulted and stabbed over 35 minutes without a single one calling the police.
And experts determined the cause wasn't universal apathy, but psychological inaction driven by pluralistic ignorance. An emergency is often inherently ambiguous. Is that a scream of distress or a domestic argument? Is that person on the ground sick or drunk?
So in that uncertainty, we instinctively look to others for clues. And because we all want to appear poised and unflustered, everyone sees everyone else failing to act or looking calm.
Which creates a cognitive loop where the event is collectively interpreted as a non-emergency. Everyone concludes, since nobody else is concerned, nothing is actually wrong.
And the victim suffers because no one wants to break that appearance of calm.
So how do we combat this? If we find ourselves in an emergency, how do we break the loop?
The victim has to eliminate the uncertainties, be precise about the need for aid. I'm being attacked, call the police. And critically, request assistance from a single specific individual.
Don't just make a general plea to the crowd. You have to assign the task. You in the blue shirt, call 911 now. Otherwise, everyone assumes someone else should or already has helped.
Another powerful factor in social proof is similarity. We are overwhelmingly influenced by the actions of similar others.
The story of Chris the swimmer is such a clear illustration of this. Chris, age 3, refused to take off his plastic inner tube despite his instructor's encouragement.
The instructor, despite his authority, wasn't similar. Then Chris saw Tommy, who was also 3 years old, swim without a ring, and suddenly Chris just jumped in and swam himself.
The logic was simple, peer-to-peer social proof. I'm 3, Tommy is 3. If he can do it, it's appropriate for me to do it.
And this relevance of similarity has profound, sometimes tragic, implications, as seen in the research on the Werther effect, or copycat suicides.
Yes, David Phillips showed that highly publicized suicides cause a significant measurable increase in subsequent single-car and air crashes in the weeks following.
And the imitation is terrifyingly specific. If the story was about a single victim suicide, the crashes generate single deaths. If it was a murder-suicide, the subsequent crashes generate multiple deaths.
Most compellingly, the imitators are most likely to copy suicides of people similar to them. A young suicide victim led to a spike in deaths among young drivers. An older victim led to older drivers dying. We look for social proof on how to cope from people like us.
This leads us to the extreme isolation and tragic compliance of the Jonestown mass suicide in Guyana, where 910 people drank poison.
Jim Jones moved the entire People's Temple to this remote jungle settlement, an alien environment. The relocation was a calculated act of manipulation that weaponized social proof through radical uncertainty and isolation.
Uncertainty is the right-hand man of social proof. In that strange new environment, the members were highly uncertain about everything: food, climate, safety. They were primed to follow the lead of others.
But the awful beauty of the strategy was that in Guyana, there were no similar others outside the group. Their sole source of social evidence, their only compass, came from within the highly committed, fanatical group led by Jones.
They were completely isolated. When the suggestion of mass suicide was raised, the social proof mechanism kicked in with nowhere else to turn. If my entire group is doing this, it must be the appropriate action.
It demonstrates how crucial it is for us to be exposed to diverse, independent social evidence.
Let's transition to our fifth weapon, which relies on generating positive feelings, liking, and association. Simply put, we are more likely to comply with requests from people we know and like.
The pressure to say yes to a friend is incredibly powerful, often overriding logic or product preference. The Tupperware party is the quintessential compliance setting for this.
Right. The true source of the request isn't the demonstrator selling the bowls. It's your friend, the hostess, who profits from the sales.
Exactly. The compliance professionals have cleverly diverted the psychological burden from themselves to the social bond. And research has shown that the strength of that bond is twice as likely to determine a purchase as the guest's actual preference for the product.
So, if liking is the mechanism, what causes us to like someone? The first is obvious, but powerful: physical attractiveness.
This triggers the automatic halo effect. Attractive people are automatically and unconsciously assigned favorable traits like talent, kindness, honesty, and intelligence.
And the data on this is stunning. Studies of Canadian federal elections show that attractive candidates got 2.5 times more votes than unattractive ones, even though voters denied that appearance played any role.
In the legal system, attractive defendants received significantly lighter sentences, being twice as likely to avoid jail time. It's an ingrained bias that affects life and liberty.
Another key factor in generating liking is similarity. We are instinctively drawn to people who are similar to us in background, opinions, or lifestyle.
Studies have shown that people are far more likely to help those who dress like them. Anti-war marchers were more likely to sign a petition for a similarly dressed requester without even bothering to read it first. The similar attire was the click-whirr signal.
A third factor is delightfully simple: compliments and flattery. Even when the flattery is a blatant, obvious ploy to win favor, we have an automatic positive reaction.
We struggle to process flattery critically. Even when we know the source is untrustworthy, the positive feeling often overrides our cognitive assessment of their sincerity.
Okay, let's look at the critical factor of contact and cooperation. Simple familiarity often breeds liking. We tend to prefer a reverse image photo of our own face because that's what we see in the mirror.
However, simple contact isn't always enough. Early school desegregation efforts often failed because the competitive nature of the traditional classroom fostered unpleasant conditions, which led to increased prejudice, not less.
The solution, as shown by the famous Robbers Cave experiment, is cooperation towards superordinate goals. Separating boys into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, quickly bred hostility through competition.
That hostility was only removed when tasks were introduced, like fixing the camp's water supply, that required intergroup cooperation for mutual success. They had to work together.
This insight led to Aronson's jigsaw classroom. Students were given individual pieces of a lesson and had to cooperate and teach each other to succeed. This stimulated significantly more friendship and less prejudice.
And the final, deeply manipulative aspect of liking is conditioning and association. This is the simple principle that an innocent association can influence our perception.
The ancient Persian messenger analogy. Messengers bringing news of victory were treated as heroes. Those bringing news of disaster were slain. The innocent association determined their fate.
Our modern equivalent is the PV weatherman. We know they don't cause the bad weather, but they receive hate mail and even threats, because the negative emotion associated with the bad news transfers to the person reporting it.
Advertisers rely on this constantly. They link products, like cars, with desirable things, like attractive models. The intent is that we transfer the positive traits of the model onto the object.
And studies show it works. Men rated cars associated with seductive models as faster and more appealing, yet they denied the model influenced their judgment. The association transferred the positive feeling unconsciously.
This brings us back to Razran's famous luncheon technique, where subjects became fonder of people and things, including political statements they experienced while eating. The positive feeling from the food transfers to whatever it's associated with.
And finally, we see many of these principles working together in the good cop, bad cop technique. It's a triple threat using liking, contrast, and reciprocity.
The technique uses liking by setting the good cop up as the suspect's savior. He intervenes, stops the bad cop, maybe buys a coffee. The suspect sees him as collaborative and trustworthy.
It uses contrast, as the good cop seems especially reasonable and sympathetic compared to the raving, venomous bad cop.
And it uses reciprocity, those small favors, the intervention, the coffee pressure, the suspect, to return the favor by cooperating and confessing to work together with the good cop.
The suspect becomes eager to give the good cop what he wants, seeing the confession as a mutual resolution.
That is truly effective manipulation. Let's move on to our sixth weapon, which involves simple deference: authority, the terrifying power of directed deference.
The Milgram experiments remain the gold standard for illustrating this. Ordinary people were recruited to act as a teacher and told to administer electrical shocks to a learner every time they answered incorrectly.
The shocks were fake, but the subjects believed they were real and painful, and they were willing to inflict continued, intense, and dangerous levels of shock, up to 450 volts, on a screaming victim, simply at the command of a researcher in a lab coat.
2/3 of subjects went all the way to the end, despite enduring extreme nervous distress. The chief finding was the extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority.
It's obedience overriding conscience. And this isn't just a lab phenomenon. The source mentions the S. Brian Wilson incident.
Yeah.
Wilson was protesting military shipments on train tracks.
The train crew, with direct orders not to stop, continued despite seeing him on the tracks, severing both his legs. And what's shocking is that later, the crewmen sued Wilson for the humiliation of being prevented from carrying out their orders without incident.
Their primary concern was the failure to adhere to the authority's command.
And this blind obedience is perhaps most terrifying in fields like healthcare, where the cost of deference can be life and death.
The legendary rectal earache case.
Uh,
A physician ordered eardrops, abbreviated as place in R,
And the nurse, deferring to authority, misread our ear as rear. She promptly put the required drops into the patient's anus. Neither the nurse nor the patient questioned the obviously senseless procedure because a legitimate authority had spoken.
That is terrifying negligence. Researchers tested this further with the overprescription experiment.
They called nurses at random hospitals claiming to be a doctor and ordered them to administer an unauthorized, grossly excessive dose of a non-listed drug, 20 milligrams of estrogen, 4 times the maximum daily dose.
And the finding was absolutely chilling. A shocking 95% of nurses complied unhesitatingly with the instruction from an unfamiliar voice on the phone.
They deferred to the symbol of authority, the title doctor, rather than using their professional intelligence or common sense to question a clearly dangerous order. It was that click-whirr response.
So the takeaway is that we are often vulnerable not to the substance of authority, but to the symbols that stand for it.
3 symbols are particularly potent. First, titles. People with higher status, like a professor or doctor, are consistently perceived as physically taller. We literally look up to them.
Second, clothing, specifically uniforms. A researcher in a simple guard uniform secured compliance far more often than when dressed in civilian clothes. The uniform triggers automatic respect.
And exploiters are brilliant at combining these symbols, as seen in the infamous bank examiner scheme. Con men use one man in a conservative business suit, the examiner, and another in a guard uniform to collect the money. The combination is devastating.
So given this extreme willingness to obey, how do we defend ourselves? We don't want to resist legitimate authority entirely. Most of the time, experts do know what they're talking about.
Right. The trick is recognizing illegitimate or compromised authority. The source suggests 2 simple questions. First, is this authority truly an expert? We have to focus on their credentials and, critically, the relevance of those credentials to the issue at hand.
The second question, how truthful can we expect the expert to be here? We need to consider their trustworthiness, especially if they stand to benefit from our compliance. Is their advice self-serving?
Compliance professionals often use the trust tactic to preempt this. They'll argue against their own interests on a minor point to establish credibility, making them more believable on the important parts.
Like the famous slogan, Avis, we're number 2, but we try harder. They admit a minor shortcoming to establish a major trust advantage.
And Vincent the waiter was the master of this. With large parties, he would initially recommend a slightly less expensive dish than what was ordered, claiming the kitchen wasn't fresh on that item. This established him as a trustworthy authority.
And having proven himself honest, patrons readily accepted his excellent but far more costly suggestions for wine and dessert.
He increased his tip percentage substantially because he'd established his credibility up front.
That level of calculated honesty is something to watch for. Okay, let's wrap up our list with the 7th and often most frantic weapon of influence: scarcity. Opportunities seem more valuable to us when their availability is limited.
Scarcity is powerful for 2 primary reasons. First, it's a simple cognitive shortcut. What's difficult to possess is typically better than what's easy to get.
But the second reason is the most profound, and it's a primal human response called psychological reactance. We inherently desire freedom, and when our freedom to get something is threatened, we desire that restricted item even more fiercely.
This starts early as the terrible 2s. 2-year-olds instinctively fight restrictions. In one classic study, when a barrier made one of 2 equally attractive toys inaccessible, boys went directly to the obstructed toy 3 times faster.
They were fighting for the freedom to choose. This is why parental interference in a teenage romance often causes the young couple to feel greater love. It's the Romeo and Juliet effect. The threat to their freedom increases their internal conviction.
And research showed that when parental interference weakened, the romantic feelings often cooled. It was the restriction that was fueling the passion.
Scarcity applies just as powerfully to information. Censoring information has a massive boomerang effect. Audiences not only want to receive it more, but they also tend to develop a more favorable attitude toward it, even if they haven't received it.
Exactly. Students who learned that a speech opposing co-ed dorms would be banned became significantly more opposed to co-ed dorms without ever hearing the speech. The restriction itself made the argument seem more valid.
We see this in legal settings. In jury trials, when judges rule evidence inadmissible, say that the defendant had liability insurance, and instruct the jury to disregard it, this often backfires.
The Chicago Jury Project found that juries awarded an average of $4,000 more when they learned the driver was insured. But when the judge told them to disregard that information, the act of official censorship, they used the information more, awarding a total of $46,000.
That's an extra $13,000 just because the judge tried to restrict their freedom.
Two optimal conditions make the scarcity weapon particularly explosive. First, new scarcity. Things that have recently become less available are valued more highly than things that have always been scarce.
This was shown in the famous cookie study. The group whose jar of 10 cookies was suddenly reduced to 2 rate-in rated those 2 remaining cookies much more positively than the group that only had 2 cookies from the start. We react most strongly to a sudden loss of freedom.
The second optimal condition is competition. We want scarce items most when we are competing with others for them. This drives a feverish, highly aroused reaction where rationality just breaks down.
Salespeople use this constantly. Real estate agents schedule 2 potential buyers at the same time, or an appliance salesperson mentioned that the last one just sold a moment ago.
Buyers, when competing, lose perspective on what they want and begin striking wildly at whatever is being contested, forgetting their original assessment of the item's worth.
This brings us to the crucial distinction we have to hold on to when we're faced with scarcity. The difference between desiring something and actually enjoying it.
Right. In the cookie study, even though the newly scarce cookies were rated as significantly more desirable, people said they would pay more for them. They were not rated as any better tasting than the abundant cookies.
So the insight is chillingly simple. The joy is not in experiencing the scarce commodity, but in the psychological satisfaction of possessing it.
If we are buying something for its function, to drive, to eat, to use, we have to remember that its quality remains absolutely the same, regardless of its manipulated availability.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive into these 7 weapons: contrast, reciprocity, consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. We rely on these shortcuts because, as the sources clearly show, the modern world is an avalanche of information and choices. A rational analysis of every decision is impossible.
These shortcuts are necessary for survival, but they make us profoundly vulnerable. So if we know the triggers, how do we defend ourselves against those who seek to exploit the automatic click-whirr?
For commitment and consistency, where someone is trying to force us into a corner based on our past actions, there are 2 signal systems we have to trust. The first is the easier one, the stomach signal.
This is that sudden tightening, that visceral knot in the pit of your stomach when you realize you are being trapped into complying with a request.
Yeah.
Deep down, you don't want to perform. It's the physical manifestation of your internal compass screaming that you are being cornered.
But what about the deeper consistency traps, like Sarah's commitment to Tim, where the internal justifications have already taken hold? The stomach signal might be overridden. This requires trusting the heart of hearts signal.
This defense requires us to step back and trust our most immediate, pure emotional response before cognitive rationalization can engage. We have to ask ourselves, knowing what I now know about this, if I could go back in time, would I make the same choice?
And crucially, you have to trust the first flash of feeling you experience in response to that question. Psychological evidence suggests we feel our emotions a split second before our conscious mind can rationalize them. That pure, basic feeling, that initial flash of regret or relief, is the signal slipping through before the commitment tape engages.
This self-awareness is our primary defense. By being aggressively aware of the trigger features, we can consciously disengage the automatic pilot when we sense manipulation is at play.
And that leads to a final, provocative thought. The increasing complexity and speed of the modern world forces us to rely even more heavily on single cue shortcuts. It makes us functionally similar to lower animals in moments of high decision density.
The greatest challenge for us is not to avoid the shortcuts entirely, we need them to function, but to be relentlessly vigilant against those who try to substitute fraudulent trigger features for true ones. Fake social proof, false authority symbols, and phantom scarcity are existential threats to our rational decision-making.
We have to be ready to identify and, in some sense, retaliate against the abuse of these essential human systems. Otherwise, we risk making critical decisions based entirely on counterfeit data, allowing manipulators to dictate our choices.
And understanding how these psychological drivers are activated is the first and most critical step toward genuine freedom of choice in the modern world.
That's all for this deep dive. See you next time.